Hey everyone, Delph here. You can check out my channels here. Today I'm going to cover Mundane, arguably one of the most bizarre things in any Dark Souls game. It's a weapon infusion which causes the weapon to scale with your lowest stat, while removing the scaling and having the base damage. In theory, this incentivizes you to have really even stats, and to maximize your scaling, all your stats would ideally be the same. In practice, however, it's not particularly good, although it's not ridiculously difficult or anything like that either. Because it turns out that a character with really even stats actually has access to lots of different options. So the character ends up being a decent jack of all trades, master of none type situation. So we'll start with the upsides. The most well-known advantage is that mundane scaling can be used to make extremely terrible weapons somewhat passable. Weapons like the broken sword hilt or the handmaid's ladle, which would otherwise be completely worthless. Obviously, this is kind of a gimmicky use for the infusion, and infusing these weapons with mundane really only makes them passable, not good or anything like that. Instead, the real advantage comes when talking about infusing an already solid weapon. Due to how mundane halves base damage and gives a fixed scaling no matter the weapon, it works best on weapons which are quick, so you're somewhat limited in terms of what weapon types you can make use of. Your options are essentially limited to thrusting swords, curved swords, bows, twin blades, and fist weapons. Anything slower than these weapon types is basically too slow to make use of mundane, since ideally you'll attack bosses twice between their attacks. Now, as you can probably imagine, mundane is hardly optimal for most of these weapon types. Nevertheless, it's not bad on any of them either, and you'll still get pretty good damage. Another advantage of mundane is how the infusion interacts with weapons. Like I already said, it halves the base damage and removes the scaling, while adding its own scaling. This scaling operates independent of two notable things. Firstly, it doesn't matter how upgraded the weapon is, you still get the maximum amount of mundane scaling. Now, upgrading the weapon will still increase the base damage, but depending on the weapon, that could be extremely small, especially given that the mundane infusion will have it as well. Secondly, even if the weapon breaks, you still get the total amount of mundane scaling, which is a nice feature. The weapon still loses its base damage, but in all likelihood that will be significantly less than the mundane scaling. One last thing to note is that you still must meet the stat requirements for the weapon in question. The mundane infusion will not override those stat requirements. Okay, so there's one last upside to mundane, and it's arguably mundane's saving grace, that being the fact that a mundane character is automatically a generalist. Investing in every stat ultimately gets you access to most of the best assets for each of the stats, believe it or not. For starters, you'll obviously have the dexterity to utilize bows and arrows, for example, which can be quite useful. Not only do you thus have access to poison arrows, but bows themselves are actually really good with mundane infusions as well, since they have low base damage and poor scaling generally. Similarly, a character who has decent intelligence and faith has access to sorceries and miracles as well, and a mundane character will probably have some investment in those stats, as well as improved scaling on pyromancies. Even more critically, a character with decent intelligence and faith has access to hexes, and the best hexes have relatively low stat requirements. So even though the mundane infusion itself is a little underwhelming, in reality a character built to maximize mundane damage will easily have access to the strongest spells and very good archery, not to mention decent armor as well. But obviously mundane has some issues, which I've already briefly mentioned. Most specifically among them is the fact that your weapon options are pretty noticeably poor. As a general rule, mundane simply gets worse results for most weapons. Any kind of slower, heavier weapon is automatically terrible. On top of that, a lot of the really fast weapons, such as daggers, have unique rules when mundane infused, and the scaling they get is lower than what it would be on another weapon. So mundane infusing a dagger or a crossbow will get you much worse results than you would otherwise hope for. The bigger issue is that you'll have access to very few weapons good at controlling enemies with mundane, so weapons like Great Club or Grand Lance are very poor candidates for mundane, and those are the sorts of weapons you could use to consistently stagger or knock down enemies. Your only real options are straight swords or twin blades, which aren't my favorite for controlling enemies. The next downside is the infusion material, which is the old mundane stone. While mundane weapons don't care too much about upgrades, obtaining old mundane stones is a huge pain. For starters, the earliest you can obtain them is at the doors of Pharos or Harvest Valley, which is a little tough to get to right off the bat, so it's going to take killing at least a few bosses. This is fine, however, since mundane infusions aren't really functional until you have maybe 12 in all stats at least. And even then it won't really pay off in terms of weapon damage until a bit later on, more like 15 in all stats. From there, for every mundane infusion you want to do, you must farm it from the enemies in Doors of Pharos, which is a bit of a pain. Now there are 4 more available in the game, 1 from a crystal lizard in Dragon Aerie, and 3 from Stone Trader Chloanne after obtaining the King's Ring. I hate this, given that it's the most bizarre infusion type, and therefore you'd probably really want to test it out on lots of weapons. So this is a major downside, but it's not the worst thing in the world, obviously. The last downside is that a mundane character grows really slow. So to gain a measly 6 damage added to your weapon in scaling, you'll have to spend 9 level ups distributed into each of the 9 stats. And that's assuming you aren't leveling one stat in particular to meet the stat requirements for a certain spell or weapon, which might be worth it in some cases. After having killed all of the bosses, I had 26 in each stat, which isn't bad or anything, but it does leave something to be desired, given that's barely enough stats to use certain weapons, and it isn't even the soft cap for hex scaling. To top it all off, you lose some damage by default as mundane, since your stat distribution prevents you from making use of Flynn's Ring, which would be really nice to have on a mundane character. When you take all the downsides together, it makes mundane arguably the weakest infusion in the game, and in my opinion worse than using any conventional scaling. Still, the upsides are considerable, so it's not totally useless or anything like that. Okay, so next we'll talk about game progression. I went with Scholar of the First Sin just because you can actually infuse your weapons earlier. As for starting class, I went with Swordsman for the high dexterity, but realistically you could go with probably any class except Deprived. Now it's going to be a while until you get access to the mundane infusion, not just because you have to get to either Doors of Pharos or Harvest Valley, but also because it's not really even worth it until you have at least 12 in each stat. So there's no sense in rushing there. In the meantime, you'll need a solid workhorse weapon to get you through the bosses, and obviously you want to upgrade it to at least +3. I use the S-Stock here. It's a solid weapon, otherwise held back by its poor scaling, but it attacks fast enough that it's actually a good candidate for a mundane infusion. Similarly, a straight or curved sword would be just fine, in my opinion. You could also use an axe or club, but these weapons are just slow enough that, in my opinion, they are poor candidates for mundane infusion, so you'll have to replace them at some point. The Castus is a good option for a mundane infusion, but until you actually mundane infuse it, it's not a good option, since the weapon's only real asset is its extremely high scaling in both strength and dexterity, so I can't recommend that weapon either, at least until you actually are able to infuse it. Next, your main goal is to get a bow. The best option is probably the short bow, which can easily be obtained in Leningrad's shop, and this bow is a great option for the rest of the game. You'll similarly want to get your hands on hexes, with the Sorcerer's Staff being a good enough catalyst. Once you have those 3 things, the only thing you'll need left is to be around 12 in each stat, and of course you'll need to open up Macduff's Workshop and then get to either Shaded Woods or Harvest Valley. I personally went to Shaded Woods. After you've killed the boss and arrived in the Doors of Pharos, you can obtain the old mundane stone from the germ enemies, and supposedly the elephant enemies as well, although I never had one drop. Your other option is to head to Harvest Valley, where the giant hammer enemies can also drop old mundane stones. This is probably the easier option, and almost certainly the better option, especially if you are playing Dark Souls 2 instead of Scholar of the First Sin. In either case, this is potentially the worst part of the mundane character, and you'll have to do this unless you want to wait at least until after you've killed Velstadt, which is quite a ways away. To make it a little faster, you can stack item discovery. The most important item for this would be the covetous gold serpent ring, and the +1 variation of this can be obtained from Magarold of Lanafir after spending 10,000 souls in his shop, which is pretty easy to do. He also sells the Jester's Cap. This is another good item that boosts your item discovery by a solid amount. Burning Bonfire Ascetics also increases the drop chances, so there's another option. Depending on how many old mundane stones you want to farm, enemies may stop respawning. To counteract this, you can join the Covenant of Champions or burn a Bonfire Ascetic. Note that to respawn the hammer enemies in the entrance to Earthen Peak will also respawn the Covetous Demon, so you'll probably want to use the Germs Respite Bonfire in the Doors of Pharos if you plan to farm lots of old mundane stones. One last important thing to note is that some of the Germ enemies in Doors of Pharos have no respawn limit, so they keep respawning infinitely, but it seems like they stop dropping things past a certain point, so I wouldn't try killing those enemies over and over again. Once you have your old mundane stone, the only thing left is to select a weapon and then to infuse it. I've already talked about your options. Basically, any curved sword or thrusting sword is decent when infused with mundane, although not as good as if you had a different stat spread. Usually when mundane is talked about, they mention the broken straight sword. The main advantage to this weapon is its low stamina consumption, but if you're running a mundane build, I see no reason why you would be having stamina problems, so I can't personally recommend this weapon. As it is, I'm not crazy about straight swords infused with mundane, since they don't attack especially fast when power stanced, and the main reason to use a straight sword would be because they're decent at staggering normal enemies. So if you want to mundane infuse a weapon just to try to stagger enemies, a straight sword is maybe an okay option. Similarly, I'm not a huge fan of fist weapons. Claws are okay since they also have bleed damage, but even when power stance, the damage is lower than it would be with other weapons. They probably benefit more from dexterity, since that would also increase the frequency of their bleed procs, instead of reducing it, which is what mundane does. The Caestus is a little more promising, since it at least offers strike damage instead of slash, and so it's probably pretty decent, assuming you are power stancing them. Another weapon type I don't recommend is daggers. They were specifically nerfed so that they get less scaling from mundane. Now, they do attack faster than other weapon types, but when power stanced, fist weapons attack almost as fast, and in fact there are several weapon types which are able to attack fast enough that you can sometimes get 2 swings in on bosses anyway. So in practice, I think daggers can't do 3, so they just aren't as good as these other weapon types. Crossbows are another weapon type which is simply outclassed as mundane. Specifically, they are outclassed by bows, even if they hadn't been specifically nerfed, so that they got way less damage from mundane. They don't have access to poison arrows, so I see no reason to use them over a bow in 90% of cases anyway. As far as sheer damage is concerned, the obvious choice is thrusting swords, specifically the 2 power-stanced rapiers. The main advantage to this is that rapiers have quite high counter damage, which can be augmented further with the old Leo ring. In my run, I used power stance S-stocks, which are just inferior in terms of counter damage and stamina consumption, so as far as I can tell, it's simply no contest, and that the way to get the maximum DPS out of mundane would be to use 2 power stanced rapiers. Infused with mundane, of course. Perhaps you could hypothetically do more damage with a dexterity character, of course, and if you level up enough, the scaling from dexterity on a fully upgraded pair of thrusting swords will inevitably outperform mundane scaling. However, that would be fairly impractical to achieve, and you'll be well into New Game Plus when that happens. Speaking of thrusting swords, one weapon I wanted to mention briefly was the Black Scorpion Stinger, which can be obtained from Man Scorpion Tark after killing Duke's dear Freya. In the original game, it can be found in a chest in the Doors of Pharos. This is a weapon I neglected to mention in the raw weapon video, and it's an absurdly strong weapon that is actually probably better than any of the weapons I did mention, at least in terms of sheer damage. So a huge mistake on my part that I somehow overlooked it in the raw video. I guess maybe I confused it with the Spider Silk, which is a much less good weapon. It is an interesting weapon as it relates to mundane though, since it actually does okay with a mundane infusion, although not as good as a raw infusion. That is unless you have 29 in all stats, at which point a mundane infusion actually eclipses raw. For most of these raw weapons, the weapon's base damage is high enough that this will never occur, but the Black Scorpion Stinger just happens to have a base damage low enough that at 29 in all stats, a mundane infusion will barely edge out a raw infusion. So in theory, if you wanted a ridiculously high level mundane character, maybe this is a really good weapon to use, I don't know. But I thought I'd mention it because it's actually a really insanely powerful weapon, especially with old Leo ring, and I should have mentioned it in the raw video, so that's a huge mistake on my part, and so I'm going to mention it now. The last weapon type that I think is worth mentioning are twin blades, specifically the twin blade, which can be bought from Weaponsmith Ornifex. This weapon is arguably the single best use case for the mundane infusion, bar none, as you would need pretty high strength and dexterity before its scaling overtook mundanes. It's about the only weapon you have as an option against normal enemies, except perhaps a straight sword or a spear, but in those 2 cases, any damage gain you saw from the mundane infusion would be negligible, if not a damage loss, at least when the weapon in question is fully upgraded. The main downside to the twin blade would be its dexterity requirement, which sits at 26. In my opinion, it's worth it to jump your dexterity a little bit ahead of the rest of your stats to gain access to this weapon. You could hypothetically consider another twin blade, but some of those are really tough to obtain, and others of those aren't really so good, so it's up to you. But probably most of the twin blades would do just fine, although in the long run you'd lose damage with a mundane infusion, unlike this twin blade, which actually does okay with a mundane infusion for a really long time. One last thing to note about twin blades is that being Sandier's Spear, which is technically a twin blade. This weapon was specifically nerfed, such that it somehow loses damage when mundane infused, despite having no innate scaling. So the weapon probably isn't usable as mundane, at least relative to a regular twin blade. So I don't recommend the Sandier's Spear. Again, it was specifically nerfed. One last curious thing to note about mundane would be its relationship to weapons with mixed damage. Mundane does not in fact remove the split damage on elemental weapons, although it does have the base elemental damage and it lowers the elemental scaling, but it doesn't remove it. On the surface, this looks good, but in practice, you actually start to lose damage as you upgrade the weapon. So usually, split damage weapons have really high base damage in both elements, in both the physical and the elemental side, to kind of compensate for the fact that elemental damage, or that split weapons are kind of bad against bosses' defenses, right? So for example, weapons like the Chaos Rapier or the Dragon Rider's Twin Blade end up losing damage when Mundane infused because the amount of Mundane scaling they gain simply can't make up for the base damage and scaling that they lose, even with really even stats. And those are theoretically the best case scenarios because those weapons attack really fast and have low base damage, right? Now, the theoretical bonus is that the proportion of physical damage increases, which could be good against enemy defenses. However, weapon buff spells such as Magic Weapon or Sunlight Blade also grant a percentage bonus to a weapon's elemental damage. So you'd be losing out on some of that if you were to Mundane infuse a weapon like, say, the Dragon Rider's Twin Blade. And a Mundane character has the stat distribution to use those weapon buff spells, so it's basically just a damage loss, which is a huge shame. So again, I do not recommend Mundane infusions on elemental weapons, but maybe that's something you can do super early in the game or something. I don't know. One last thing to talk about is catalysts, mostly just to cast Dark Orb. My personal recommendation is the Witch Tree branch, since it has such a fast cast speed. Obviously, the Sunset Staff would be stronger, but it unfortunately is only obtainable at 20 Int, 20 Faith, which is fairly high. And it's a Twinkling Titanite weapon, which I kind of hate. So I just made use of the Witch Tree branch. I just infused it with Dark. It was basically just as good, and I got to enjoy that extremely high cast speed. Okay, on to rings. The obvious options apply here: Chloranthy Ring, Ring of Blades, and Ring of the Third Dragon. Unfortunately, due to this character's stat distribution, you won't be able to make use of Flint's Ring, but Covetous Silver Serpent Ring is also a solid choice. If you're using a thrust weapon, Old Leo Ring is a must, and if your weapon has Bleed on it, then Crest of Blood is also fine. And of course, you could do casting-related rings such as Clear Bluestone Ring. That would probably be pretty good too. As for your level ups, obviously the main gimmick of this character is that your stats are evenly distributed. However, you may want to jump some of your stats to hit certain breakpoints, especially early on. The main one would be making sure that you get access to Dark Orb as soon as possible, so you want to have 12 Int, 12 Faith, as well as some attunement so that you could actually attune a copy of Dark Orb as well. The next possible use for jumping your stats would be to gain access to the Twin Blade, which has a whopping 26 Dex requirement, and probably it's worth it to hit that 26, when the rest of your stats are around at least 20 or so. Maybe a little earlier. It'd be fine to jump your dex ahead to 26. It's up to you. From there, it's pretty clear cut. And after I'd killed all the bosses, I ended the game with around 27 in all stats. And I did okay damage. Okay, so that's basically everything you need to know about Mundane. To recap, as far as I can tell, the best way to DPS bosses would be to power stance 2 Mundane Rapiers while you have the Old Leo Ring equipped. Other possible options would be a Power Stance Mundane Castices or a Mundane Twin Blade. That would also probably do alright. I legitimately think that these are practically your only options, assuming your goal is to maximize DPS with Mundane, although Power Stance Claws with the Ring of Blood equipped is probably pretty close to these three. But in a lot of ways, none of this really matters since your character can cast Dark Orb, which is probably the way that you should be contending with most enemies, and you can even use against bosses pretty efficiently as well. Couple that with access to decent armor and decent bow damage with poison arrows, and you end up with actually a surprisingly solid and flexible character, even though the Mundane infusion itself is pretty bad. So, you know, it's not that terrible. It's a little bit of a challenge character, especially to start with. It's pretty clear that the Mundane infusion is probably the worst infusion in the game by far. But anyways, thanks for watching.